When King Robert Baratheon dies, Westeros is thrown into a succession war as the noble houses clamor for power. And when the Padishah Emperor decrees that House Atreides will rule over Arrakis and be in charge of the valuable spice harvesting, it is only then revealed that House Atreides is conspired against to throw them down once and for all. And in 1914, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand is assassinated in Sarajevo. While certainly not the only reason, the assassination is the spark that ignites Europe and sends it hurtling into the First World War. Conflict is what defines great stories, and it's often what fills our real life history books as well. When we look at stories, the ones that are the most gripping, the ones that really catch our attention, it's always centered around conflict. If there's no struggle, no confrontation, then you have a boring story on your hands. Hi, welcome to Earthmote. I'm Randall. Today we're going to be continuing our Sandbox game series, and I'm going to be talking about how I like to start off my Sandbox game design. So let's go ahead and get into it. When creating a new Sandbox campaign, there are a lot of different ways to start things off. Perhaps you have an idea for a map or monsters or a kingdom you want to feature in the sandbox. Those are all great ideas to begin with and start building. But I like to start with something a little bit different. I prefer to start with conflict because conflict is what you need to bring your sandbox to life and make it a dynamic environment for your players to interact with. So by starting with conflict, every other decision we make about the sandbox and as we design it will keep the conflict in mind and can serve to support and enrich that conflict. My goal when designing a sandbox is to develop interesting setting with established conflicts and motivations. And that offers the players a wide set of choices on how they wish to interact with the campaign. I build the factions and the problems, then I let my players decide who they want to side with and what they want to undertake or what to avoid. My goal when designing a sandbox is to develop an interesting setting with established conflicts and motivations that offer the players a wide set of choices. When I build my factions and the problems that beset them, I'm letting my players decide who they want to side with or who they wish to avoid altogether. It's always up to them, but it's your job as the game master to give them those unique and interesting choices. Wolfgang Bauer of Kobold Press talks about the goal of good campaign setting design is to stack as many boxes of dynamite as possible. And if you look at the introduction of the Dark of Hot Springs Island, you see that Jacob Hurst, Evan Peterson, and Donnie Garcia describe it as a sandbox of black powder. These analogies are very apt. Build your sandbox with conflict in mind, then seed it with many different hooks and threads for your players to pull on, only for them to realize that the threads are tied to the end of hand grenade pins and they set everything off in their own faces. So I think it's worthwhile asking yourself about what sorts of conflict you want those kingdoms and peoples and other elements to face. So if you have some ideas about your sandbox nouns, then start to make a list about the conflicts that would fit naturally with them. For example, if you want to have a mage order faction featured in your sandbox, then ask yourself what sort of supernatural conflicts could they be causing. Perhaps they've been summoning and cavorting with devils. The second option you have is you can start a bit more conceptual. Perhaps you haven't really thought about what you would like your next campaign to entail yet, at least in terms of your physical nouns within your sandbox. Then you could start with the sorts of conflicts you'd like to see within your sandbox. Just jot things down on a list that sound like they would be interesting to you and something that the players could get tangled up in. And better yet, are there conflicts that your players could tip the scales when they get involved in? Now, if you're new to this, don't worry. There are tools and analyses we can borrow from other media fields to get us started. So let's go ahead and take a look at some of those. When examining traditional storytelling media, conflict is broken out into the internal versus external conflicts. At this point in our sandbox building, we care about and want to focus on external conflict. Internal conflict is often controlled by the players and how they choose to role play at the table. Once you get to know more about your players' characters and their goals, you as a game master can have a stronger influence on their internal conflicts. But for now, when we are building the sandbox, it is external that gets our attention. We aren't writing novels, but the traditional literary conflicts are a useful starting point for conceptualizing your sandbox conflicts. There are 5 external conflicts that are mapped for literary analysis, and while those conflicts are often listed or described as person versus X, that is because most stories are focused on a single character or a handful of them. But for our intents and purposes, we'll be interested in how entire factions or very powerful individuals are interacting with one another. And this conflict mapping works beautifully for that too. The first literary external conflict is person versus person. This is your most classic trope pitting man against man. And of course, in fantasy, we extrapolate that to any number of fantasy humanoids that you wish to have in conflict with one another. War, oppression, control, and territorial disputes are all classic examples of person versus person conflicts. The next one is person versus nature. In this type of conflict, our characters encounter a natural force that they must deal with. This could be weather or more bestial-like creatures. In our case, in a fantasy world, we have a large swath of fantastical creatures we could use, and you could use creatures with a more bestial intelligence, such as a dangerous predator that lurks in a cavernous mine, or you could use more intelligent creatures aligned with nature, such as a group of dryads that wish to protect their forests from a group of entrepreneurial humans hoping to clear cut the forest for its natural resources. Thirdly, you have the person versus society conflict. In this conflict, characters are set against tradition, a law, or some other societal construct. Religious and economic strife are great conflicts that fall under this category. This is all about focusing on what's the status quo in your world, what is accepted by the inhabitants of the world, or at least the ones that are currently in power, and who is trying to change that and why. That is essentially your conflict in a person versus society setup. Next, we have person versus supernatural. Monsters, magics, and other inexplicable phenomena all fall under this category. As a fantasy sandbox, you'll definitely want to include supernatural elements into your conflicts. That is what twists it and makes it into a fantasy story rather than a traditional medieval story. The last main conflict centers around person versus technology. When science or technology develop beyond human control, conflicts of person versus technology develop. This type of conflict is going to be more prevalent in a sci-fi focused game, or if you are using a collapsed civilization type fantasy, then perhaps the inhabitants of a distant past had a far more superior technological advances than what you see in your modern fantasy sandbox setting. In that case, your players can encounter some ancient technology that has been unbound by human control. So now that we have an idea on the types of conflicts that we can use, I recommend sketching out 3 to 6 conflicts for your sandbox. Pick a few that make sense to the type of game that you might be interested in running. I'll use my sandbox I'm currently developing as an example. In my case, I'm interested in the idea of societal cycles. Societies usually have a growth phase where they start to rise to prominence, and then eventually they have kind of a stagnation, and perhaps they become a bit decadent and corrupt as they neglect what made them great in the first place. And ultimately, they have a collapse. So I'm going to want a person versus society conflict sort of heavily featured in my sandbox. I actually had 2 ideas around this. I wanted a sandbox where there was sort of a recent societal collapse. And by recent, I mean in the last 250 years in game time. And I decided that that past civilization was defeated by a rebellion with divine inspiration. And that divine blessing ultimately sparked the birth of a new religious institution that has become dominant in the region since the rebellion. But of course, that religious organization has grown fat and corrupt in their own right over the last 250 years that they've been in power. So then I decided to have another religious interpretation be introduced. And of course, these upstarts are branded as heretics by the established institution. And as a result, we have a nice little religious war or rebellion on our hands. I decided that the recently collapsed kingdom was led by a group of powerful mages. They're the ones that grew neglectful and corrupt. These mages historically had a religious bent to them, and as a result, when the gods grew displeased with their servants, they sent divine intervention to start a revolution and begin anew in the region. With the ultimate success of the rebellion, the area grew distrustful of these mages, and most were killed or driven out. Of course, we have some of them survive, and their descendants and heirs hope that they can one day reclaim what was lost to them. This adds in another layer to that conflict. Third, I'm a big fan of nature and having sort of awe-inspiring wilds in my games and different sort of natural elements incorporated into my sandboxes. When I was kind of brainstorming around this one, I kind of came up with 2 main ideas. The first is centered around more of the fantastical nature. The Fae are something that are really interesting to me. They're kind of meddling in mortal affairs is interesting. So I thought maybe in the distant past, the Fae actually inhabited the area, and at some point they were kind of driven out or pushed back. But they still have some influence on the area, and the more powerful ones that survived actually maybe fled to different demi-planes where they now kind of rule over. This sort of allows them to kind of come into the world in a more limited environment and also allow the players to maybe find ways to access those natural demi-planes and kind of see what those different areas have to offer. So I think that's kind of a cool and thematic element. Secondly, I like the idea of kind of some sort of natural resource being valuable in the area. And I came up with 2. One more kind of common trope was around mithril, that's sort of a fantastical metal that's very precious and valuable. I thought that that might be interesting to have some conflict over in the region, who controls it, and its general value and power in the area. And I actually came up with the idea that this conflict actually might be more person to person rather than persons versus nature. And that's okay. We don't need to, hit every different external conflict when we're building our sandbox. You can sort of twist and blend them how you like, and they're just really here to inspire us. So in my idea, I was thinking maybe having a dwarven kingdom that was really controlled the mithril mines. But in this case, that dwarven kingdom was a electoral monarchy. So there were different clans that vote to elect the next sort of ruler of their kingdom. Obviously, a lot of power and influence and prestige comes with that. So the different clans are interested in getting one of their own elected as monarch. And if the main clans can't come to a agreement on who should be the next monarch, then the ones that have sort of stood up or nominated for the position may enter into this kind of controlled civil war where they fight it out under these sort of clan rules until one is declared the victor and ultimately elects the monarch. Current civil war is ongoing, so the players can maybe get involved in it in either make friends or enemies of the different dwarven clans depending on who they want to side with. I will probably also have some other minor resources being fought over as well in the sandbox, but those were kind of the Mithril was kind of the main central one that I was looking at. So based on those three main ideas that I've come up with, I will essentially iterate and reiterate on them. I want to think about how I can tie those different ideas and conflicts into one another in different and minor ways. I'll also create some branching conflicts around those ideas that may involve different factions or different areas of the sandbox that allow them to sort of come into contact with one another. You want to create these different sort of contact points and friction points that the players can experience and interact with. Ultimately, those conflicts give me a lot to build off of for my sandbox and a lot to work with in terms of starting to stack up those different dynamite crates for my players to find and play with. Hopefully those ideas help you get started on your own sandbox, and just keep in mind conflicts and you'll be off to a solid start as you start building. Let me know in the comments where you like to start building out your own sandboxes and what approaches you find work best for your own campaigns. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.